He was only 8 years old, far too young to understand the cruelty of the world, yet old enough to face its sharpest injustice. In a courtroom filled with power and prejudice, no one expected a little black boy to stand his ground. The judge watched, the lawyers sneered, and the jury braced for an easy outcome. But what unfolded shocked them all. How could a child, burdened by a system stacked against him, turn the tide with nothing but his mind? This is the story they never wanted told. Before the courtroom gasps, before the headlines, he was just a child. An 8-year-old boy with a bright smile and a mind that raced faster than anyone around him. He loved puzzles, books stacked taller than his small frame, and asking questions that even adults struggled to answer. At home, his mother often reminded him to dream big, even when the world tried to make him feel small. Life was never easy. The neighborhood carried the weight of poverty, the streets lined with stories of broken promises. Still, he found joy in small things, the sound of chalk scratching across a board as he solved math problems faster than his teacher expected, or the quiet satisfaction of proving people wrong when they underestimated him. But talent alone doesn't shield a child from prejudice. At school, whispers followed him, and in public, eyes lingered longer than they should have. He felt it, even if he didn't fully understand it. To some, he wasn't just a boy, he was a challenge to stereotypes they weren't ready to let go of. And yet, none of that prepared him for what was waiting. A courtroom, heavy with silence. Men in suits confident in their authority. A system that had failed countless others before him. He wasn't supposed to win, wasn't supposed to be heard. But destiny had already placed him in a position that no child should ever face. This wasn't just the story of a boy. It was the story of how innocence collided with injustice, and how brilliance would force the world to watch. The courtroom was never meant for children. Its heavy wooden doors, its towering walls lined with cold portraits of men who once held power, it all seemed designed to shrink anyone who dared to walk inside. And in the middle of that space, barely tall enough for his head to reach above the railing, sat an 8-year-old boy who had already learned that the world didn't see him as innocent. The air was thick, buzzing with whispers. Some jurors shifted in their seats, curious but skeptical. Lawyers stacked their papers in neat piles, glancing at one another with a smirk that carried the same message: this will be easy. No one expected resistance, not from him, not from a child. But what brought him here was not just a twist of fate. It was a chain of injustice, each link forged long before he ever walked into this room. It began weeks earlier, when his neighborhood became the target of suspicion. Police cruisers rolled slowly through the streets, their flashing lights turning familiar corners into scenes of quiet fear. Children playing outside grew still, parents drew their kids inside, and the boy noticed how even laughter seemed to vanish when authority arrived. One afternoon, he stood at the edge of the street, clutching a schoolbook far too advanced for his age. He had been proud that day. His teacher had pulled him aside, amazed at how he solved a logic puzzle faster than anyone in the class. But pride turned to unease when he noticed the stares. 2 officers, parked nearby, watching him as if brilliance itself was suspicious. Minutes later, an accusation. A mix-up, they claimed. A store theft blocks away, and somehow this child, a boy holding nothing but a book, fit their description. His protests went unheard, drowned beneath the weight of authority. That was the first blow. Not the worst, but the beginning. In the days that followed, his family's life grew heavier. His mother's voice trembled when she spoke, her eyes tired from endless nights of worry. Neighbors shook their heads, whispering about how fragile innocence was when skin color painted you guilty before a word was spoken. The boy felt it, too, the shift in how strangers looked at him, the way teachers hesitated before praising his intelligence in public. He realized that silence was no longer safety. Silence was a weapon, wielded against him. If he didn't speak, if he didn't defend himself, the world would decide who he was without his permission. But what power does an 8-year-old have against a system that silences men twice his age? When the summons came, it didn't feel real. His name, so small, so new to the world, printed on a paper surrounded by legal jargon no child could understand. His mother's hands shook as she folded the notice, whispering prayers through clenched teeth. The day of the hearing, the courthouse loomed like a fortress. People inside whispered about the case of the boy, some amused, others annoyed. A child in a courtroom was unusual, but not impossible. And in this case, it was entertainment, a spectacle no one expected to last longer than a few minutes. But the boy's mind was different. Where others saw barriers, he saw puzzles. He listened carefully, absorbing every word, every gesture, every inconsistency. He noticed when a lawyer misstated a fact, when a juror avoided eye contact, when the judge leaned forward at key moments. He didn't yet know the full rules of the game, but he understood logic, and logic was a weapon too. The trial unfolded with a cruel predictability. The lawyers spoke confidently, certain of their victory. They painted him as reckless, as dishonest, as a child incapable of truth. Their words dripped with condescension, their tone a constant reminder that he was not seen as equal, not even as human, but as a problem to be disposed of. The boy sat still, listening. But inside, anger began to simmer. Not the kind of anger that explodes, but the quiet kind that sharpens, that fuels focus. He remembered his mother's words, "Knowledge is power. They can take everything from you, but not your mind." And so he waited, like a chess player studying the board, watching his opponent reveal weaknesses they didn't know they had. It was during the cross-examination that the shift began. A lawyer, smug and careless, presented a timeline that didn't match the evidence. To the courtroom, it was a small detail, easy to overlook. But to the boy, it was the crack in the wall, the piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. He raised his hand. Not timidly, but with the quiet authority of someone who knew. The room fell into an uneasy silence. The judge frowned, the lawyer scoffed. But then he spoke, calm, clear, precise. He pointed out the inconsistency, connecting it to statements made earlier. His explanation was simple, almost too simple, but undeniable. For the first time, the jury leaned forward. For the first time, the smirk faded from the lawyer's face. Whispers erupted in the gallery. Some dismissed it as a child's luck, others exchanged wary glances. But deep down, everyone knew, this was no accident. As the proceedings dragged on, the boy continued to spot errors, subtle biases, and contradictions that seasoned adults had overlooked. Each revelation tilted the balance slightly, each correction chipped away at the wall of prejudice. And yet, the weight of history pressed against him. This was not just about one case, one courtroom. It was about centuries of injustice, about voices silenced before they could rise. The system had been built to resist moments like this, to ensure that brilliance from the margins went unnoticed. Every step forward carried risk. Every word he spoke was met with disbelief, with attempts to twist his intelligence into arrogance. But the boy did not waver. He had seen too much to remain silent. By the third day, the atmosphere had changed. The jury no longer dismissed him. The judge, once impatient, now studied him closely. And the lawyers, those men who had entered the room so certain of victory, grew restless, their confidence unraveling. But with change came danger. Power does not surrender easily, and the more the boy dismantled their case, the more desperate they became. Whispers of manipulation filled the air, accusations that his so-called intelligence was a trick, that his mind was being controlled by others. The boy sat in silence, the weight of the accusation pressing down. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. Could brilliance alone overcome a system determined to silence him? The courtroom waited, breathless. And in that pause, on the edge of collapse, he prepared for the move that would either shatter everything, or prove once and for all that truth could not be silenced. The real battle was only just beginning. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Not the calm silence of respect, but the heavy, breathless kind that comes when the world is waiting for something to break. Every eye was locked on the child, a boy no taller than the bench he leaned against, his small hands folded neatly on the wood. He had already dismantled contradictions, exposed careless lies, and revealed truths no one had expected him to see. Yet in this moment, the weight pressing down on him was greater than any puzzle he had solved. The prosecution had grown desperate. They had failed to intimidate him, failed to silence him, failed to make him stumble. Now, they chose the one weapon they knew could wound him deeper than logic ever could, his identity. The lead lawyer rose slowly, his polished shoes echoing against the marble floor. His smile wasn't friendly, it was the kind that carried poison. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice smooth but sharp, "what we see here is not brilliance, but manipulation. This boy, he doesn't belong in a courtroom. He doesn't understand what's happening. He's a child. And yet, somehow, he comes here with rehearsed lines, with logic too advanced for someone his age. Ask yourself, who's really speaking? Him, or the adults feeding him words?" Gasps rippled through the room. The lawyer let the accusation hang, turning slowly toward the boy, pointing a finger as though labeling him an imposter. "This is not genius. This is a trick. And worse, it insults the intelligence of every man and woman in this room." The boy's chest tightened. He wanted to speak, wanted to protest, but he could feel the weight of disbelief rising like a tide. He looked to the jury and saw their eyes shifting, uncertain now. The ground beneath him trembled, not physically, but in the fragile balance of perception. And then came the cruelest blow. The lawyer leaned closer, lowering his voice to a dagger's edge. "And let us not forget, he is not just a child. He is a black child. You know what that means. He's been taught to resist authority. To twist the truth. To play the victim. This is not intelligence, it is defiance disguised as cleverness." The word struck harder than any gavel. The room, already tense, cracked open into a dangerous silence. Racism, once an unspoken undercurrent, was now dragged into the light, wielded openly as a weapon. The boy's heart pounded. His mind raced faster than ever before, but for the first time, it wasn't puzzles or logic he was calculating. It was survival. He could feel the trap closing around him, the centuries-old narrative that black children were troublemakers, liars, incapable of innocence. He knew if he stayed silent now, their voices would bury him. But if he spoke carelessly, they would twist his words until they strangled him. The judge's gavel struck once, calling for order, but even he seemed rattled. The lawyers smirked, confident that they had cornered their opponent at last. And then, the boy lifted his head. Slowly. Deliberately. His small frame seemed fragile, but his eyes burned with something that startled even those who doubted him. When he spoke, his voice did not tremble. It carried the calm precision of someone who understood the stakes. "You say I don't belong here because I am a child. You say I don't belong here because I am black. But if truth only belongs to adults, then why did none of them see what I saw? And if truth belongs only to those with power, then maybe power has been lying for a very long time." The courtroom froze. His words weren't rehearsed, they were raw, sharp, undeniable. He turned toward the jury, meeting their eyes one by one. "You don't have to believe in me. But you cannot ignore the facts. You cannot ignore the mistakes that I have shown you. And you cannot ignore that the only reason they want to silence me is not because I am wrong, but because I am not who they expected the truth to come from." For the first time, the lawyer's face lost its composure. He shifted uneasily, his weapon of prejudice slipping from his hand as the boy dismantled it with nothing more than conviction. The tension in the room cracked like thunder. Jurors whispered, some nodding slowly as if awakening from a spell. The gallery stirred, people leaning forward, phones ready to capture what history had tried to hide too many times. The boy continued, his words flowing with the rhythm of truth that needed no defense. "All my life, I've been told to stay quiet. To not question. To let others decide who I am. But silence has never protected children who look like me. Silence has only made it easier for others to decide our fate. Today, I choose not to be silent." Every sentence struck like a hammer. The walls of prejudice that had towered over him began to crack. Even the judge, hardened by years of procedure, leaned back, his stern face softening in the realization that something extraordinary was happening before his eyes. But the fight was not over. The opposing lawyer, flustered but unwilling to surrender, raised his voice again. "Objection. This is not testimony. This is a performance." The judge hesitated, his gavel poised. The lawyer pressed harder. "This boy is turning the courtroom into a stage. He is manipulating the jury with emotions. Facts come from adults, not from children who don't understand the law." The boy's small hands clenched the railing. His voice rose, steady but fierce. "Facts don't belong to adults. Facts don't belong to lawyers. Facts don't belong to judges. Facts belong to truth. And the truth is, your story doesn't add up. You tried to make me guilty because it was easy. But justice is not supposed to be easy. Justice is supposed to be right." The words thundered louder than the objection. Louder than the gavel. Louder than the centuries of silence that had been forced upon voices like his. The courtroom shifted from disbelief to awe. What had begun as a trial meant to shame and silence had transformed into something no one expected, a revelation. An 8-year-old child, standing not just for himself, but for every silenced voice that had come before him. For the first time, people weren't just seeing a boy. They were seeing the truth that prejudice had tried to bury, the brilliance, the resilience, the humanity that no system could fully erase. Tears welled in the eyes of his mother as she clutched the edge of her seat. Strangers in the gallery found themselves holding their breath, some wiping their faces quietly, others recording, knowing they were witnessing something unforgettable. And then came the final moment, the one that would decide everything. The boy had spoken with courage, dismantled lies with clarity, and stood unbroken against the weight of racism. But the system was still the system. The jury still had to decide. The judge still had to rule. The room held its breath as the judge cleared his throat, leaning forward, his expression unreadable. The jurors exchanged glances, their faces tight with conflict. Some seemed convinced, others hesitant, bound by the chains of their own doubts. The boy stood silently now, his eyes fixed on them, his future hanging on their decision. The gavel hovered in the judge's hand. And in that suspended second, before verdict, before resolution, the question burned across the courtroom, across history itself. Would truth finally be enough to shatter injustice? The gavel finally fell, but in truth, the sound of that strike carried far beyond the courtroom walls. The judge's words confirmed what the boy already knew, that the truth, once spoken, cannot be silenced. The case unraveled, the accusations collapsed, and the lawyers who once smirked now sat in uneasy silence. Against every expectation, the voice of an 8-year-old black boy had not only defended itself but exposed the cracks in a system designed to break him. The jury shifted in their seats, some ashamed, others inspired. The judge's face, once hardened, softened for a fleeting moment as he looked down at the child who had done what many grown men had failed to do, stand unflinching in the face of injustice. And when the boy left the courtroom, his mother's tears told a story words could not: relief, pride, fear, and the weight of knowing that victories like this were rare. Because while one case ended, the larger battle raged on. The boy's triumph was not a guarantee of safety, not a shield against the prejudice waiting outside those heavy doors. What happened inside that room was extraordinary, but it was also a reminder of how extraordinary it had to be for people to finally listen. He could not simply be a child, he had to be brilliant. He could not simply speak, he had to dismantle lies with precision. For black children, innocence was never enough. And that is the deeper wound. His story is not just about one boy in one courtroom, it is about a system that demands perfection from the oppressed just to grant them what others are given without question. It is about how truth can be spoken loudly, clearly, undeniably, and still be doubted if it comes from the wrong mouth, the wrong skin. Yet, his courage left a mark. In that moment, the jury, the judge, the entire gallery were forced to reckon with something they could not dismiss. They saw not a stereotype, not a statistic, but a child who refused to be silent. And for everyone who watched, inside the courtroom or later through the stories that spread, it planted a question too heavy to ignore. If an 8-year-old can see the truth so clearly, why can't we? The boy would grow older, carrying both the scars and the strength of that day. He would remember the silence that almost swallowed him, and the power of the moment he chose to break it. And those who heard his story, whether in whispers across neighborhoods or through the echoes of history, would remember too. Because this was never just his story. It was the story of every child forced to grow up too soon. Every parent who prays their child comes home safely. Every voice silenced before it could speak. His brilliance may have shocked a courtroom, but his courage was a mirror held up to the world, forcing it to see itself. And so the question remains, not just for juries or judges, but for all of us, how many more children will have to fight battles this heavy before justice is more than a performance? How many more voices will have to scream before silence is no longer the default? The answer is not his to give. It is ours to decide.